The grand conclave chamber floated in the endless dark of space like a jewel spinning slowly against the stars. And within its curved walls, the representatives of 47 species had gathered for what they believed would be another routine session of trade, disputes, and border negotiations. Ambassador Rethkai of the Selthari Dominion stood at the central podium and watched the assembled delegates with his 3 large eyes, his bioluminescent frills pulsing a calm blue as he waited for silence to fall across the massive chamber. The Selthari were known throughout the galaxy as careful creatures, methodical in their thinking and slow to act without overwhelming evidence. So when Rethkai had requested an emergency motion to be heard before the full council, many had been surprised. Arbitrator Moxiel clicked his massive mandibles together in the insectoid equivalent of clearing one's throat, and the chamber fell silent at once. For the arbitrator commanded respect that came from leading a species that had conquered 3-star systems through military might alone. Ambassador Rethkai. Moxiel said in his clicking voice that the translation devices rendered into smooth speech. You have requested time before this body to present an emergency motion, and we have granted this request despite the unusual nature of your petition. Rethkai bowed his long neck in the traditional gesture of gratitude and stepped forward until he stood in the very center of the speaking floor where all eyes could see him clearly. Honored representatives of the Galactic Trade Union, he began, his voice steady despite the rapid pulsing of his emotional frills. I stand before you today to propose a motion that I know will seem strange and perhaps even foolish to many of you gathered here. He paused and let his gaze sweep across the chamber, taking in the diverse forms of life that filled the curved benches rising up on all sides. From the crystalline beings of the hegemony, who caught the light like living diamonds, to the massive fur-covered Vorathi, who could crush starship hulls with their bare hands. I propose, Rethkai continued, a complete and total ban on human participation in all joint military operations conducted under the authority of this council. For a moment there was silence as the words registered in the minds of the assembled delegates. And then the laughter began. It started with a snickering sound from the Drelvani section and spread like a wave across the chamber, growing louder and more unrestrained as more species joined in the mockery. The humans were a young species, barely 5 centuries removed from their first faster-than-light journey, and they were seen by most of the elder races as amusing newcomers who had somehow stumbled their way into the galactic community through luck rather than skill. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 4 death world, a planet so hostile that most species could not survive on its surface for more than a few hours without extensive protective equipment. The gravity was crushing. The weather was violent and unpredictable. The native wildlife was designed by evolution to kill in 1,000 different ways. And the humans themselves had spent most of their history killing each other with creative enthusiasm. By all logic, they should have been broken creatures, traumatized by their brutal environment into a state of permanent fear and weakness. Yet somehow they had clawed their way into space and earned a minor seat at the trading tables of civilization. Arbitrator Moxiel let the laughter continue for several long moments before raising one of his 4 arms to call for order. Ambassador Rethkai, Moxiel said with amusement clear in his translated voice, you wish to ban the humans from our military operations, and yet they barely participate in such operations as it stands, for they possess only a handful of combat vessels, and their military doctrine is focused entirely on defense of their own small territory. That is correct, Arbitrator, Rethkai replied, his frills now pulsing a deep purple that indicated distress to those who knew how to read Selthari emotions. Then perhaps you could explain, Moxiel continued, why you believe these newcomers pose such a threat that they must be excluded from operations in which they have shown almost no interest. More laughter rippled through the chamber. And Vrethkai waited patiently for it to subside before he spoke again. "I do not propose this ban out of hatred for humanity," he said, his voice dropping lower so that the delegates had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "Nor do I propose it because I believe them to be incompetent or unworthy of alliance." He paused, and his frills shifted to a shade of blue so dark it was almost black, a color that most species had never seen a Selthari display. "I propose this ban out of mercy," he said, "out of compassion for every species in this chamber, out of a desperate hope that none of you will ever have to witness what I have witnessed." The laughter had faded now, replaced by a confused murmuring as the delegates tried to understand what the Selthari ambassador was saying. Commander Threll of the Varathi Martial Collective rose from his seat, his massive frame casting a shadow across several neighboring delegates, and his deep voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. "You speak of mercy and compassion," Thrall growled, "yet you offer no evidence for your claims. And the Varathi do not make decisions based on vague warnings and emotional appeals. The commander speaks truth." Ambassador Yenny of the Crystalline Hegemony chimed in, her voice ringing like bells as her fasted body caught the light. For what evidence could possibly justify such an extreme proposal? Vrethkai nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response and had prepared for it long in advance. "I have evidence," he said quietly. "Evidence that I had hoped I would never need to share with this council. Evidence that I have carried with me for 6 standard cycles like a weight around my neck." High Arbitrator Moxiel clicked his mandibles in what might have been curiosity or might have been continued amusement. For insectoid expressions were difficult to read even for experienced diplomats. "Then present your evidence," Moxiel said, "and let this council judge whether your fears have any basis in reality, or whether you have simply allowed your imagination to create threats where none exist." Vrethkai bowed his head for a moment as if gathering his strength, and when he looked up again, his 3 eyes held an expression that several delegates would later describe as haunted. "I will present my evidence," he said, "but not here in this open chamber where it might spread panic among species unprepared to witness such things." He looked directly at High Arbitrator Moxiel, holding the insectoid's compound eyes with his own unblinking gaze. "I invite any representative who doubts my warning to join me in a private briefing chamber in 3 days' time, where I will show them footage that was recovered from a human vessel's black box recorder." The murmuring grew louder, and Moxiel raised his arms for silence once more. "Very well," the High Arbitrator said. "Your motion is tabled for ceremonial review pending the presentation of your evidence, and I myself will attend this private briefing, if only to put an end to this foolishness once and for all." Vrethkai bowed once more and withdrew from the speaking floor, his frills pulsing in colors that no translator could interpret, but that several of the older delegates recognized as deep and terrible fear. As he made his way back to his seat, he passed by the small human delegation that occupied a modest section near the back of the chamber, and for just a moment his eyes met those of the human ambassador, a woman named Dr. Sarah Park, who had been watching the proceedings with an expression of mild confusion. She smiled at him and nodded politely. Clearly unaware of what was about to unfold, Vrethkai returned the nod, but could not bring himself to smile back. For he knew something that she did not yet understand. He knew that in 3 days, time the galaxy would learn the truth about humanity, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The private briefing room was smaller than Vrethkai had expected, but it would serve his purposes well enough. For the intimate setting would make it harder for the assembled delegates to hide their reactions when the footage began to play. 7 ambassadors had accepted his invitation, though he suspected that most of them had come to mock him rather than to learn. And High Arbitrator Moxiel sat at the head of the curved table with his compound eyes gleaming in the soft light like polished obsidian Commander Threll of the Varathi occupied nearly a quarter of the available seating space. his massive frame barely fitting into the chair designed for smaller species, and his deep-set eyes watched Rethkai with the patient intensity of a predator waiting for prey to make a mistake. Ambassador Yenny of the crystalline hegemony had positioned herself near the main display screen, her faceted body throwing rainbow patterns across the walls whenever she moved. And beside her sat the reptilian delegate from the Scaleth Combine, whose name Rethkai could never quite pronounce correctly. The remaining seats were filled by representatives from the Melodari Chorus, the Gent Collective, and the Outer Rim Coalition, all species that considered themselves too advanced and too powerful to fear anything that the young human race might represent. We are all assembled. High Arbitrator Moxiel clicked, his mandibles moving in what Rethkai had learned to recognize as impatience. So perhaps you will now explain why you have wasted our valuable time with this theatrical performance. Rethkai moved to the front of the room and activated the display controls with a gesture of his long fingers. But he did not yet bring up any images on the screen. Before I show you what I have brought you here to see, he began, I must provide context so that you will understand the full significance of the footage. Commander Thrall growled low in his throat, but said nothing. And Rethkai took this as permission to continue 6 standard cycles ago, Rethkai said. A Selthari research colony on a world called Kelveth. Prime sent an emergency distress signal that was received by our nearest military outpost. He paused to let the significance of the location register with his audience, and he saw several of the delegates stiffen slightly as they recognized the name. The signal reported that a harvester swarm had emerged from subspace, approximately 200 kilometers from the main colony complex, and was moving toward the populated areas at standard consumption speed. Ambassador Yenny's crystalline form began to ring with a low frequency that Rethkai recognized as the hegemony species equivalent of fear. For the harvester swarms were among the most terrifying threats in the known galaxy. They were not a species in the traditional sense, but rather a kind of living catastrophe. Billions upon billions of small organisms that moved together as a single hungry entity and consumed everything organic in their path. A harvester swarm could strip a planet of all life in a matter of days. And even the most advanced military forces in the galaxy had never found a reliable way to stop them once they had emerged. The colony held 12 million Selthari civilians. Rethkai continued, his voice steady despite the memories that the words brought flooding back. And our nearest fleet was 6 standard days away at maximum faster than light speed. Then they were already dead. Commander Thrall said bluntly, for the Varathi were not a species that believed in softening harsh truths. No force in the galaxy could have held a harvester swarm for 6 days. That is what we believed as well. Rethkai replied, but there was one factor that we had not accounted for in our calculations. He brought up the first image on the display screen, showing a battered mining vessel with the words UE, S Perseverance painted on its hull in the angular script that humans used for their primary language. A human mining ship was in the system when the swarm emerged, having stopped at Kelveth, primed to resupply before continuing to the asteroid fields in the outer reaches. Moxiel clicked his mandibles in what might have been surprise, or might have been continued skepticism, and his compound eyes fixed on the image of the human vessel. The Perseverance carried a crew complement of 340 humans, Rethkai said, none of whom had any formal military training beyond the basic self-defense courses that humans require all their spacefaring personnel to complete. You are telling us, the Scaleth delegate hissed, his forked tongue flickering with agitation, that 300 civilians faced a harvester swarm to protect a colony of another species. I am telling you, Rethkai replied, that 340 humans held that swarm at bay for 51 hours until our fleet arrived. The room fell silent in a way that Rethkai had never experienced before. A silence so complete that he could hear the soft humming of the station's life support systems through the walls. "That is impossible," Commander Thrall said finally. But his voice lacked the certainty it had held before. The Varathi have studied the harvester swarms extensively, and no force of that size could survive against them for more than a few hours at most. 218 of the humans survived, Rethkai said, and I have spoken with many of them in the cycles since the incident, trying to understand how they accomplished what should have been impossible. He looked around the room and saw that even High Arbitrator Moxiel was now leaning forward with something that looked like genuine interest, replacing his earlier contempt, but words cannot convey what happened on Kelveth Prime. Rethkai continued, "And so I have brought you here to witness the footage that was recovered from the Perseverance's black box recorder after the battle." He moved to activate the recording, but paused with his finger hovering over the control. "I must warn you," he said, his bioluminescent frills pulsing in colors that conveyed deep unease, "that what you are about to see has been verified by 3 independent forensic teams and is confirmed to be completely authentic. We are not children to be frightened by warnings," Moxiel clicked impatiently. "Show us your evidence and let us judge its significance for ourselves." Rethkai nodded slowly and entered the command to begin the playback. "Very well," he said quietly. "But understand that once you have seen this footage, you will carry its images with you for the rest of your lives, just as I have carried them for the past 6 cycles. He stepped away from the controls and moved to the side of the room where he could watch both the screen and the faces of his audience. The recording begins approximately 4 hours after the humans first engaged the swarm, he said, by which point they had already established what they called a defensive perimeter around the main civilian shelters. The screen flickered to life and filled with images of chaos and fire and darkness. And Rethkai watched as the assembled delegates leaned forward to witness the impossible thing that a handful of humans had done on a world called Kelveth Prime. He knew that within the next hour their understanding of humanity would be transformed forever. And he prayed to whatever gods might be listening that they would be wise enough to heed his warning. For he had seen the truth about the human species, and it had given him nightmares that no amount of time could erase. The footage began with the sound of screaming, not the screams of terror that the delegates might have expected, but rather the screams of humans shouting orders to one another across a battlefield that should have killed them all within minutes. The camera was mounted on the helmet of a human soldier, or rather a human miner who had become a soldier by necessity, and through his eyes the delegates could see the nightmare that had descended upon Kelveth Prime. The harvester swarm filled the horizon like a living wall of darkness, billions of small creatures moving together in a pattern that seemed almost beautiful until you realized that everything they touched was being devoured down to the molecular level. "Fall back to position 7, a voice shouted through the recording, and the camera view swung around to show a group of humans dragging what looked like industrial mining equipment through a narrow street. "They are using their mining tools as weapons," Commander Thrall observed, his deep voice filled with grudging respect despite himself. "Improvised plasma cutters and sonic drills converted for combat." Rethkai nodded, but said nothing as the footage continued, showing the humans forming what they called hunting parties and moving toward the swarm rather than away from it. "Why are they advancing?" Ambassador Yenny asked, her crystalline form ringing with confusion. "Any rational species would retreat and attempt to evacuate. The civilians could not be evacuated in time," Rethkai explained. "The swarm was moving too fast and the transport ships were too few. So the humans decided to buy time by attacking the swarm's coordination nodes. The footage showed what he meant as a squad of 15 humans charged directly into a cluster of the swarm organisms, their improvised weapons blazing with light and heat. At the center of the cluster was a larger organism that pulsed with bioluminescent signals, and the delegates could see that the surrounding swarm creatures moved in response to its commands. They identified the command structure, Threll said, his tactical mind working despite his shock. And they are targeting it to disrupt the swarm's coordination. Yes, Rethke said. But watch what happens next. The squad had almost reached the coordination node when the swarm began to converge on them from all sides. And one by one the humans fell as the creatures overwhelmed their defenses. But one human kept moving forward. A woman whose name tag identified her as engineering specialist, Chun. And even as the swarm closed around her, she continued to advance with her modified mining laser held before her like a shield. She is carrying the weapon toward the node, the Scaleth delegate hissed. But it will not have enough power to destroy it from that range. Watch. Rethkai said quietly. Chun reached the coordination node and stopped, her body already covered with the small creatures that were beginning to consume her flesh. And then she did something that made no sense to any of the delegates watching. She overloaded the mining laser's power core and held it against the node as it began to explode. The footage from that camera ended in a flash of white light, but another camera picked up the aftermath from a distance, showing the coordination node destroyed and the surrounding swarm creatures falling into confusion. She knew what she was doing, Ambassador Yenny whispered, her ringing voice barely audible. She knew she would die, and she did it anyway. The footage shows that she remained conscious for approximately 11 seconds after the explosion, Rethkai said. The medical analysis suggests that she experienced significant pain during that time. He paused, and his frills pulsed with colors that defied translation. The footage also shows that she was smiling. The recording continued, jumping from camera to camera as it showed scene after scene of humans doing impossible things. A squad of 7 humans held a single corridor for 19 hours, taking turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts while their companions fought the endless tide of swarm creatures that tried to break through. Their position, a medical officer named Dr. Park continued, treating wounded colonists even as the building around her began to collapse, refusing to evacuate until every patient had been moved to safety. Captain Marcus Webb lost both of his legs to the acidic secretions of the swarm organisms but continued to command his crew from a stretcher for another 12 hours. His voice never wavering as he directed the defense even as his life slowly drained away. And throughout it all the humans sang. They sang work songs that their ancestors had sung in the mines and factories of Earth. Songs about hardship and endurance and the stubborn refusal to give up even when all hope seemed lost. They sang battle hymns from wars that had been fought centuries before they were born. Songs about courage and sacrifice and the bonds that tied soldiers together in the face of death. They sang and they fought and they died. And for 51 hours, they held back a force that should have swept them aside in moments. But the moment that broke the assembled delegates came near the end of the recording, when the swarm had finally pushed through the outer defenses and was approaching the last civilian shelter. The camera showed a young human standing alone in a corridor, his uniform torn and bloodied and his face pale with exhaustion. And his name tag identified him as Cook 3rd Class Michael Torres. He was the ship's cook, a man whose primary job had been to prepare meals for his crewmates. And he had no weapon that could stop the swarm from reaching the hundreds of Silthari children sheltering in the room behind him. What is he doing? The Melodari delegate asked, her voice trembling in a way that her species used to express deep distress. Torres reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device that the humans called a lighter, a simple tool used to create flame, and then he looked directly at the camera and spoke. Tell my family I love them," he said. "And tell these people we were glad to help." He held the lighter to his uniform, which had been soaked in some kind of accelerant, and within seconds, his entire body was engulfed in flames. The swarm creatures stopped their advance, their primitive instincts screaming at them to avoid the extreme heat. And Taurus stood there burning as they swirled around him, unable to pass. "How long?" Commander Thrall asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 4 minutes, Vrethkai replied. The footage shows that he remained standing for 4 minutes before his body finally collapsed. The final camera showed the reinforcements arriving, Selthari soldiers flooding through the corridors to find the burning remains of Michael Torres still blocking the door to the shelter. The children inside were unharmed. The footage ended, and the room fell into a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the delegates like the gravity of a dying star. High Arbitrator Moxiel's mandibles hung slack in an expression that Vrethkai had never seen an insectoid display before. And when the Arbitrator finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. "How?" Moxiel managed, his compound eyes fixed on the blank screen, as if he could still see the images that had played across it. "How do they do such things?" Vrethkai moved to the front of the room and stood where all the delegates could see him, his frills pulsing with the deep blue of profound sorrow. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the question I have been trying to answer for 6 cycles." He looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes and seeing the reflection of his own horror mirrored in their alien faces. "And the answer I have found," he continued, "is the reason I have proposed the ban." Delegates sat in stunned silence, waiting for him to continue, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, no longer certain of anything they had believed about the young species called humanity. The silence in the briefing room stretched on for what felt like hours, though in reality only a few minutes had passed since the footage ended, and the delegates sat frozen in their seats like statues carved from different materials, but united in their shared disbelief. High Arbitrator Moxiel was the first to move, his compound eyes blinking rapidly in the insectoid equivalent of trying to process overwhelming information. And when he spoke, his clicking voice had lost all traces of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier words. "I have witnessed many things in my long career," Moxiel said slowly. "I have seen worlds burn and species fall and empires crumble into dust. But I have never seen anything like what those humans did on that colony world." Commander Thrall rose from his seat and paced the small room like a caged predator, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he worked through the tactical implications of what he had witnessed. "The Vorathi are considered the greatest warriors in the galaxy," Thrall rumbled. "We have built our entire civilization around the pursuit of martial excellence and the perfection of combat techniques." He stopped pacing and turned to face Vrethkai with an expression that might have been shame on a face capable of showing such emotion. "I do not believe that any Vorathi warrior could have done what those humans did," he admitted. "We are trained to fight and to die with honor, but we are not trained to burn ourselves alive while standing guard over the children of another species." Ambassador Yenny had been ringing continuously since the footage ended, her crystalline body producing harmonics that her species used to express emotions too complex for ordinary language. And now she finally found words to accompany the music of her distress. "They felt fear," Yenny said, her voice cutting through the low vibrations of her emotional state. "I could see it in their faces and hear it in their voices. They were terrified the entire time they were fighting." She turned to Vrethkai with something approaching desperation in her faceted eyes. "How can a species feel such fear and still do such things?" she asked. "In the hegemony, we have always believed that courage was the absence of fear. But what those humans showed was something else entirely." Vrethkai moved to the display console and brought up a series of documents that appeared on the screen in translated text. After the battle, I spent many months interviewing the survivors, he explained, trying to understand how they had accomplished what should have been impossible. He highlighted a section of text that contained a quote from one of the human crew members. This is what engineering specialist Torres said when I asked him why they had fought so hard to save a colony of aliens they had never met before. The delegates leaned forward to read the words on the screen, words that had been translated from the human language, but that still carried the strange power of their original meaning. They were people, the quote read, kids and families and regular folks who were scared and needed help. And what else were we supposed to do? Just fly away and let them die. That is not who we are. He speaks as if there was no other option. The Scaleth delegate hissed, his forked tongue flickering rapidly, as if protecting strangers at the cost of their own lives was simply the natural thing to do. That is precisely the point, Vrethkai replied. I asked many of the survivors why they had not simply fled when they realized the scale of the threat they were facing. He brought up another quote on the screen. This is from Navigator Yusuf, who lost his arm during the fighting but continued to operate the ship's sensors until he collapsed from blood loss. The words appeared in glowing text, simple and direct, and somehow more frightening than any weapon the delegates had ever faced. Captain always said the ship is just metal. People are what matter. When those things started coming for the colonists, we did not even have to discuss it. Everyone just knew what we had to do. Moxiel's mandibles clicked in a pattern that his species used to express profound unease, and he rose from his seat to stand beside Vrethkai at the front of the room. You said that you found an answer to your question, the High Arbitrator said. You said you understood why they do these things. So tell us what you learned. Vrethkai's bioluminescent frills shifted through a spectrum of colors as he gathered his thoughts, finally settling on a deep shade of purple that indicated he was about to share something of grave importance. In Selthari culture, we have a word for beings whose survival instinct can be consciously suppressed, he began. Beings who are capable of ignoring the most basic biological imperative in order to pursue some other goal. He paused, and his three eyes swept across the assembled delegates. We call such beings broken, he said. Damaged, incomplete, for we believe that no healthy creature would willingly override its own desire to survive. And the humans? Commander Threll asked. Do they have a word for such beings? They do, Vrethkai replied. They call it bravery, and they consider it one of the highest virtues that a being can possess. The room fell silent again as the implications of this statement settled over the delegates like a cold fog. They are not broken, Ambassador Yenny said slowly, her ringing voice filled with dawning horror. They have simply evolved to consider survival as something that can be traded for other values. Not just traded, Vrethkai corrected, willingly sacrificed, gladly given up in exchange for things they consider more important than their own continued existence. He brought up the final quote on the screen. Words from Dr. Park, who had refused to leave her patients, even as the building collapsed around her. I was scared the whole time. The quote read, Everyone was, but being scared does not mean you stop doing what needs to be done. You just keep going anyway because that is what people do, Commander. Thrall let out a long breath that rumbled through the room like distant thunder. They override their fear through an act of will, he said. And there was something in his voice that sounded almost like awe. They feel the terror just as strongly as any other species would, but they simply choose to continue despite it. Yes, Vrethkai said, and that is why I proposed the ban, not because the humans are weak or unworthy, but because they are more dangerous than any species this council has ever encountered. Moxio turned to face him with confusion evident in the angle of his antennae. Dangerous, the High Arbitrator clicked. But they saved your people. They sacrificed themselves to protect colonists. They had no obligation to help. They did. Vrethkai agreed. And that is precisely what makes them so terrifying. He moved to the center of the room and spread his arms wide in a gesture that his species used to indicate the enormity of what he was about to say. Think about what you have just witnessed, he urged. Think about what it means that these creatures are capable of such things. His frills pulsed with alternating waves of color as his emotions overwhelmed his ability to control them. They burned themselves alive to save strangers, he said. They held a line for 19 hours against impossible odds. They fought and died with songs on their lips and smiles on their faces. He let his arms fall to his sides and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Now imagine what they would do to someone who threatened their children. The delegates stared at him as the full weight of his words crashed over them like a wave. The ban I proposed was not to keep humans from fighting alongside us, Vrethkai said. It was to ensure that no species in this council ever makes the mistake of fighting against them. He looked at each delegate in turn, meeting their eyes with an intensity that none of them could hold for more than a moment. For I have looked into the soul of humanity, he concluded, and I have seen what they become when they are pushed beyond their limits. And I tell you now, with absolute certainty, that the galaxy is not prepared for what would happen if someone were foolish enough to truly make an enemy of the human race. One standard cycle after the private briefing, the Grand Conclave chamber was filled to capacity once again. But this time there was no laughter and no mockery as ambassador. Vrethkai took his place at the central podium. The 7 delegates who had witnessed the footage had spent the intervening days speaking quietly with their colleagues, sharing what they had seen in hushed voices that carried the weight of genuine fear. And now the entire council sat in tense silence waiting to hear what would come next. High Arbitrator Maxiel rose from his seat and addressed the assembly with a gravity that none of them had ever heard in his voice before. Ambassador Vrethkai presents his revised motion. The High Arbitrator announced, I wish to share some additional information that I have personally verified through our most trusted intelligence sources. He activated the main display, and a star map appeared showing the small region of space that humanity controlled. A modest territory that most of the elder races had dismissed as insignificant. In the 200 years since achieving faster-than-light capability, Maxiel continued, humanity has fought 14 defensive wars against various aggressor species. He paused and his compound eyes swept across the chamber. They have never initiated a conflict, he said. They have never attacked another species without provocation. They have never sought to expand their territory through conquest. He let those facts settle over the assembly before delivering the next piece of information. They have also never lost. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers as the delegates processed this revelation. For it seemed impossible that such a young species could have such a perfect record of victory. Current human military doctrine is built around a principle they call proportional response, Maxiel explained. When attacked, they respond with exactly matching force. No more and no less. He brought up a timeline on the display showing a series of conflicts that most of the delegates had never heard of. During an incident at a system called Theta Ceti, he continued, the species known as the Krelth Imperium destroyed a human colony of 50,000 civilians. The display showed the human response. A precision strike against a single Krelth military installation that killed approximately the same number. The humans did not escalate, Maxiel said. They matched the attack exactly, and then they waited. The Krelth believed this showed weakness and attacked again. And again the humans matched their response precisely. And this pattern continued for 6 exchanges, with each side destroying equivalent targets. Commander Threll leaned forward with intense interest, his tactical mind working to understand the strategy behind such restrained behavior. On the 7th exchange, Moxiel said, his voice dropping lower. The Krelth deployed a biological weapon against human civilian populations. The display updated to show the casualties, and several delegates gasped as the numbers appeared. 2.3 million human civilians died in that attack, the High Arbitrator said, including many children. He paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. The humans did not respond with proportional force. He brought up the final entry in the timeline, a single line of text that made several of the delegates physically recoil in their seats. The Krelth Imperium no longer exists. What do you mean it no longer exists? Ambassador Yenny asked, her crystalline voice ringing with alarm. Are you saying the humans destroyed their homeworld? I am saying that within 18 standard months of the biological attack, Moxiel replied, every Krelth colony had been neutralized. Every Krelth military vessel had been destroyed, and every member of the Krelth species had been either killed or scattered to the far corners of the galaxy as refugees. He deactivated the display and turned to face the assembly. The humans call this form of warfare total war, he said. It is a concept that exists in their history going back thousands of years. A willingness to commit every resource and every citizen to the complete annihilation of an enemy that has crossed certain lines. He stepped aside and gestured for Vrethkai to take his place. I have reviewed Ambassador Vrethkai's revised motion, the High Arbitrator concluded, and I support it without reservation. Vrethkai moved to the podium and looked out at the assembled delegates with his three eyes, seeing fear and confusion and desperate hope for guidance in their alien faces. The motion before this body is not to ban humans from fighting alongside us, he said. It is to establish as binding interstellar law that no species may engage in hostilities with humanity without the unanimous consent of this council. He paused, and his bioluminescent frills pulsed with colors that conveyed the depth of his conviction. Humanity is not a threat to the peaceful species of this galaxy. He continued, they are traders and explorers, scientists and artists, parents and children. They wish only to live their lives in peace and to build connections with other beings across the stars. He raised his voice so that every delegate could hear him clearly. They will extend friendship to any who offer it honestly. They will trade fairly and keep their agreements and honor their alliances with a loyalty that borders on the fanatical. His frills shifted to the deep warning red that he had displayed once before in this chamber. But I have looked into the soul of their species, he said. I have seen what they become when pushed beyond their limits, when someone threatens what they love. When the line is crossed, that transforms them from peaceful neighbors into the most terrifying force this galaxy has ever known. He thought of Michael Torres standing in flames to protect children who were not his own. Of Sarah Chun smiling as she sacrificed herself to destroy an enemy node. Of Captain Webb commanding his crew from a stretcher with his life pouring out onto the floor beneath him. They will burn themselves alive to save strangers, Vrethkai said quietly. Imagine what they would do to protect their own. He bowed his head for a moment and then looked up to meet the eyes of every delegate in the chamber. I recommend we never find out. The vote was called and the motion passed unanimously, with not a single delegate willing to take the risk of opposing it. 3 years later, a human diplomat named James Okonkwo was appointed as humanity's first full representative to the Galactic Trade Union, achieving full membership faster than any species in the Council's history. At his inauguration ceremony, High Arbitrator Moxiel presented him with a small object wrapped in ceremonial cloth. And when James unwrapped it, he found a simple device that humans used to create flame. One of your people taught us what this means, Moxiel said, his compound eyes fixed on the small lighter with something approaching reverence. We wished you to know that we remember. James Okonkwo smiled politely and thanked the High Arbitrator for the thoughtful gift. Though he had no idea why such a simple object would be given such importance at a diplomatic ceremony, He carried the lighter with him for the rest of his career, keeping it in his pocket during negotiations and treaties, and all the countless meetings that filled his days as humanity's voice among the stars. He never learned why every alien he met seemed to treat it like a sacred relic, why they would fall silent when he pulled it out to fidget with during long discussions, why some of them would actually bow their heads when they saw the small flame it produced. But he noticed that in all his years of diplomacy, no species ever threatened humanity or challenged their interests, or dared to cross the lines that other young races were forced to defend with blood and fire. The galaxy had learned its lesson about humanity, and though James Okonkwo never understood exactly what that lesson was, he benefited from it every day of his long and peaceful career. And somewhere in the archives of the Selthari Dominion, the footage from Kelveth Prime remained locked away, shown only to those who needed to understand why humanity was treated with such careful respect. For the universe had many dangers and many threats, but there was one truth that every spacefaring species had come to accept as fundamental law: you did not make an enemy of humanity, not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced, but because when pushed beyond their limits, they became something that no rational species wanted to face. They became human, and that was enough to keep the peace for generations to come.